my dream is to make a kind of a national federation of Japan-related associations and institutes, and then have an annual conference so that we can communicate more internally rather than just talking to international community. I think we have to talk to each other first rather than talk to outside community. So that's the kind of a big challenge. And the next one is that I find an increasing opportunity in Korea that we can have a so-called East Asian consortium of Japanese studies associations and specialists, because I talk to Chinese specialists and I talk to Japan specialists. Then we have a Korea-Japan Northeast Asia centered consortium of the East Asian studies people, the Japan studies people, and make one maybe called as a East Asian League of American Association of the Association of the Asian Studies. So then Japan specialist people can gather together and then have some session in English and some session in Japanese. Possibly some local languages can be provided at the same time. So that's a kind, and then we can deal Japan with from a comparative perspective, especially among the East Asian countries. Very interesting. As time goes by, I always encourage my students to compare Japan and Korea much more extensively than before. So which is a very challenging and interesting topic. And finally, I think the globalizing and the more internationalizing the Japan studies in Korea is quite a challenge. I think I have to expose more specialists, the Japan specialists, to the international community of scholars. And then if not, at least to translate the works done in Japan, in Korean to English, so that many can be benefited from the richness of Japan studies in Korea. Believe it or not, I think I would say that the Japan specialist in Japan is the only contender we have. Possibly Ted will not agree with me, but still, because of the depth of training and the widest of all these the research experiences, I think we can compete even with Japanese specialists in Japan. So we have grown up that much, but that the result, outcomes of our research have not been fully introduced to the English-speaking community. So I think that is the kind of biggest challenge I would say. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Director Abe and the Terasaki Center, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, today, I'm really excited to join such a stimulating discussion participated by a group of experts on Japanese studies from various parts of the world. Well, it's a great honor, personal honor for me to be here as well. I have worked for the Japan Foundation for more than 30 years, and I was recently appointed the Director General of the Japan Foundation, New York, after having spent a year and a half in Washington, D.C. as a visiting fellow of the Johns Hopkins University. So this is a sort of my inaugural event as Director of the Japan Foundation, New York, involving the rich world of the Japanese studies around the world today. My discussion today focuses upon the history of the funding environment of the Japanese studies in the United States, the response of the Japanese government to what we call the crisis of Japanese studies in the United States back in 1970, and its implications to the contemporary field of the Japanese studies, specifically in the United States, but perhaps globally as well. So please let me begin. Judging from a historical perspective, it is almost impossible to consider the birth of the support programs by the Japanese government to Japanese studies overseas without taking into consideration the context of grant making by the US federal government and large US philanthropy to area studies, including the Japanese studies during the Cold War era. It is a historical fact that the basic idea of supporting Japanese studies in the US by the Japanese government in the form of establishing an institution with a large permanent endowment, which is a Japan Foundation, they emerged as a response to the crisis of the Japanese studies in the US in the year 1970. So what is the crisis of the Japanese studies in the United States in the year 1970? Well, this means a quite pessimistic outlook on the future state of the Japanese studies in the US, which was broadly shared by the prominent academic leaders who had participated in the deliberation process as the Joint Committee on Japanese Studies organized by the Social Science Research Council and the American Council on Land Societies back in 1968. Well, as many of you know, well, this joint committee was proposed by Professor John Hall of Yale University in 1967 to Joseph Starr of the Ford Foundation, and the Ford Foundation sponsored establishing the committee consisting of 9 expert panels and, of social sciences and humanities. Providing leadership and serving as a clearinghouse for research and development of Japanese studies in the US, the Joint Committee had played a vital role in the field. And after 30 years of its operation, it was decommissioned in the middle of the 1990s. One of the most initial missions of the committee was to examine the state of the Japanese studies in the US at the late 1960s and identify a number of issues which have significant relevance for the maintenance and expansion of the field of the Japanese Studies Committee. After 18 months of this survey and deliberations, the committee published a 300 pages report titled Japanese Studies in the United States in 1970. The report included such findings as there are about 500 professional researchers and graduate students specializing in Japanese studies in 135 institutions nationwide, and B, approximately 88% of these people has PhD, and C, 6,620 people are being registered at the Japanese language courses operated by the Modern Language Association. Well, in this report, we can recognize a giant leap of the US-Japanese studies community at the time from the state of the field around 1934, when Professor Yasaka Takagi of the Tokyo University made a survey and reported that there are only 13 American Japanologists who can fully utilize original Japanese document. The 2 financial support schemes mainly contributed to this quantitative expansion of the field of the Japanese studies. The first one was the post-World War II support to area studies from large US philanthropies, including the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation. And the second one was the large-scale US public funding to area studies, particularly based on the National Defense Education Act of the 1958. Well, as you know, this huge policy-oriented investment by the US federal government was prompted and realized by the aftershocks of the event widely known as the Sputnik shock back in 1957. The public funding scheme based on the National Defense Education Act benefited the US scientific research community, foreign language education, particularly Russian language, and what we call area studies in general. And of course, the Research and Educational Committee of Japanese Studies was one of the primary beneficiaries of the public funding scheme. The continuous federal funding from the National Defense Education Act to Japanese studies satisfied the need of the Japanese studies community in those days pretty well. The Japanese studies in the US, which had originally started as either special area studies programs or what we call centers that exist outside of existing traditional disciplines, was compelled to employ new faculties, to purchase new library materials, to establish new scholarship programs for students, and to secure their own research fund, because they couldn't take advantage of existing budgetary resources as well as human resources from departments of traditional disciplines. And the support from the National Defense Education Act and the large US philanthropies perfectly responded to the need of the US Japanese Studies community, serving as a huge booster for the growth and expansion of the field throughout the period from the late 50s and the late 60s. Well, however, there came a big turning point around 1968. In the US federal government, the reduction of the federal budget deficit, which had been expanded due to the Vietnamese War and rising social cost associated with a Great Society plans, became a most prioritized issues. And as a result, the drastic cut of the NDEA budget in early 1970s was anticipated as early as 1968. So in this sphere of philanthropy as well, the terrain started to shift. And the Ford Foundation, for example, prepared its withdrawal from its support to area studies so that the foundation can prioritize the issues related to social science, justice, such as overcoming poverty. The 1960s is an era during which Japan enjoyed economic growth and emerged as one of the global powers. Japan began to draw global attention, and it was general consensus embraced in the United States that the support for Japanese studies was quite significant in terms of academic as well as policy perspectives. Well, however, the actual funding policy of the US federal government and the large US philanthropy was headed to a totally different direction. And it was out of this worry that the leadership of the US Japanese Studies community those days, including Professor Marius Jansen and Professor John Hall, sounded an alarm on future contraction and or disappearance of Japanese studies in the US as a distinctive academic field. So this is a brief overview of the crisis of the Japanese studies in the United States in 1970s and the backdrop with which a SSRC ACL's Joint Committee report on Japanese studies in 1970 was written. The Joint Committee report advocated a departure of Japanese studies from a regional research program to an ordinary academic discipline. And as for the issues of funding, the report strongly encouraged the individual effort from universities and colleges to secure their own funding for employment of faculties and librarians, and for research fellowships, for student language training, and for documentation acquisition. At the same time, however, the report also suggested, with strong sense of recommendation, that an introduction of new funding from Japan to cover such expenses be seriously sought. Well, in short, the report conveyed a strong message and expectations from the US to Japan over the future funding to sustain and expand the Japanese studies in the US, while acknowledging the previous US contributions to the field, and prompting further individual fundraising effort from individual university. On the other hand, a side of the Pacific, a consideration and planning for establishing a new cultural exchange foundation was simultaneously in progress around this period. The Cultural Affairs Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was in charge of this task, and they played a central role for realizing this national initiative. Well, in the simultaneous progress of the event across the Pacific, what's important is the impact that the SSRC ACL's joint report had given to the MOFA's planning process to establish support programs for Japanese studies overseas that would be implemented by the new Cultural Exchange Foundation, which is the Japan Foundation. The Cultural Department translated all 300 pages of the Joint Committee report into Japanese and incorporated its suggestions and recommendations made by the committee into the bill to establish the Japan Foundation, so that the new foundation can support Japanese studies overseas, particularly in the US, through making grants to research fellowships, institutional support, and library acquisition support, etc. Well, 2 years after the translation of the Joint Committee report, the Japan Foundation bill passed the National Diet and became the Japan Foundation law. Then the Japan Foundation was established in 1972 as Japan's first public funding entity to support Japanese studies overseas and other cultural exchange programs. Well, looking back the history pertaining to the state of the Japanese studies in the US during the late 1960s, the establishment of the Joint Committee on Japanese Studies and the publication of its report, and the creation of the Japan Foundation in 1972 all together, well, I strongly feel that a proactive thinking and activism from the US academic community, consisting of researchers and educators in the field of the Japanese studies, made a difference. And actually, it did play a very significant role for securing its own funding from Japanese public sector to sustain the vigor and the further expansion of the Japanese studies community in the United States throughout the 1970s, 80s, and the 90s. In 1975, the Japan-United States Friendship Commission was established as a new federal agency with a partial fund paid by the Japanese government to the US in relation to the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. And the Friendship Commission also began supporting Japanese studies in the US. So, operating in tandem, the Japan Foundation grants and the grant from the Friendship Commission worked quite well in the United States. And after the middle of the 1970s, the so-called Tanaka Fund, which was given to 10 selected US universities as an endowment to promote Japanese studies, augmented the funding effects generated by the Friendship Commission and the Japan Foundation. So in addition, there came support from the US Educational Department, such as the Title VI grant to the Japanese studies in the US after that. So roughly speaking, these three governmental funding mechanisms have constituted a major public funding scheme to the Japanese studies in the United States since 1970s. And this tradition or mechanism or framework, whatever you call, has not substantively changed since then, despite the drastic changes in various external conditions, fiscal, financial, social, or geopolitical, have emerged during the past 40 years, and particularly in the most recent decade. The most notable changes in this period are twofold. The first one is the fiscal, and the second one is monetary or financial. Well, in the fiscal front, both the Japanese government and the US government are facing this severe fiscal deficit. The outstanding debt of the Japanese government has become so gigantic, it has mounted to the degree of 10 trillion US dollars. The US federal government is also having a tremendous gap between the revenue and the outlays. They combined with the act of the dysfunctional government and the Congress, the idea of sequestration has become a matter of a reality. The pressure from the fiscal front in both governments has adversely affected the funding proficiency of US-Japan public sector support mechanism to Japanese studies. The budget of the Japan Foundation that is attributable to the government appropriation dropped nearly 40% during the past 20 years. And we also have observed the decrease of the partial funding, abolition of the US federal funding in Title VI grant to Japanese studies in the United States. Well, given the circumstance, I cannot help but saying that these negative elements in fiscal side have cast a dark shadow on the sound sustainability of the Japanese studies in the United States. But in the monetary sphere as well, I should say that the effect and the implications of so-called low interest rate era or Teikindi Jidai is tremendous. The average interest rate that a 10-year government bond, Japanese government bond, bared in the 1970s was about 7 to 8%. Well, even as recently as the beginning of the 1990s, thanks to the Bank of Japan's policy to absorb the excessive liquidity that had accumulated during the bubble economic period, the annual 6% interest rate was secured with a 10-year government bond. Well, in the US, similar high interest rate policy was employed by the Federal Reserve, and the annual 8% of interest rate was a matter of fact, at least during the Reagan era. But however, again, the terrain has shifted. nowadays, it is the general consensus that the rate of sovereign debt must be low, extremely low. Otherwise, the country would face a serious sovereign risk and become a failing state like some nations in Europe that have induced a global financial crisis. And you are aware of that and recall that the prototype of the two main public funding mechanisms in Japan and the United States, the Japan Foundation and the US-Japan Friendship Commission, is the endowment model, which is legally restricted to invest its own endowed funds only to the public bond markets in both countries. The purchase of the Japanese governmental bond consists of the largest portfolio in the investment of the Japan Foundation, and I believe that most of the endowment funds of the US-Japan Friendship Commission also goes to the UST bond. It does not need rocket science to calculate the significant drop in terms of the return of the investment into the public bond market by these two institutions. The current UST bond with 10-year maturity bears only 1.8% of annual interest. The Japanese case is much severer and lower. The same type of bond bears only 0.8% of interest annually. So compared to the interest rates in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when the yield of the endowment investment was much higher and a bigger return was, from the bond investment was secured, the current rate of the interest in US and the Japanese national bond is almost nothing, or just a fraction of what we used to have. So from this monetary perspective as well, the current public funding scheme to the Japanese studies in the US is facing serious challenges, and perhaps this also has a big implication to Japanese studies community globally in terms of the continuous funding capability of the Japan Foundation to the field of the Japanese studies in countries other than the US. Well, I'm afraid that I spoke too long and I need to wrap up. So what we need to do now, or what do practitioners like us and academics of the Japanese studies jointly need to consider and act facing these new serious challenges? Well, my tentative conclusion and suggestion may be too shallow and still at an infant stage, but I think that perhaps it is time for all of us who are engaged in the promotion of the Japanese studies in the US and the globe to take seriously this issue of the public funding contraction. And once again to recall and consider the meaning of the proactive thinking and attitude of those great leaders of the Japanese studies in the United States back in 1968, who had engineered the idea of establishing a joint committee and sought for a new path for new funding sources to Japanese studies. So I think the establishment of a nationwide committee to examine and deliberate significant issues that potentially affect the entire community of the Japanese studies in the United States, including the issue of public funding, should be seriously sought. Well, this committee may be ad hoc and may consist of members representing nationwide diversity in Japanese studies community, and would examine and discuss overall policy issues on behalf of the entire Japanese studies field. Well, perhaps we do not currently have such policy-oriented committee either in the US or Japan. The Japan Foundation's American Advisory Committee on Japanese Studies is mainly a technical screening committee for the Japan Foundation's award programs. And neither the board of the US-Japan Friendship Commission nor bilateral process of what we call CALCON, the Japan-US Conference on Culture and Educational Intercourses, discuss exclusively the future visions of the Japanese studies in the United States. So in short, the National Forum to examine and discuss the future picture of the field of the Japanese studies in the United States as a whole is simply non-existent or lacking. So well, the current situation surrounding public funding to Japanese studies in the US is, in a sense, quite similar to that of 1968. With a sense of urgency, I strongly feel that the establishment of Second Joint Committee on Japanese Studies as a sequel of the SSRC ACR's Joint Committee is quite necessary at this right moment. Well, I think I should stop here, and I would welcome and appreciate your comments on this idea of mine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Chano. We're running a little bit late, so why don't I ask the members of the panel to join us up at the front here, and we can continue the conversation on the opportunities and challenges and broken fences of Japan-related work in a global context. We'll open the floor for discussion.
Ask a question that has nothing to do with this, but
maybe a short one.
yeah. Is there any remnant of Japanese studies in North Korea at this time?
He was wanting to work on Japan and North Korea. I don't think there is any direct connection between North Korea and Japanese studies. There might be indirect strategic implication, but not direct linkage.